In the last 2 years, the video game industry has had its fair share of controversies, but one is still going to this day, and that is the endless debate of should games cost $70. On one hand, you have people saying no game is worth $70, and on the other hand, you have people fighting for companies and developers to be able to charge the price due to rising development costs. My take on this topic is very nuanced. I feel like games have been rising in quality for decades, and with that rise in quality, the price has only changed once in that time. So we were due for a price increase. It's just that it came at the worst time possible. In an ideal world, publishers and developers would have waited to increase the price until after the craziness of the world calmed down. But with everything costing more, so do games. I remember a time where I would hear stories of games costing over $200 million to make and go, wow, that's crazy. It was so insane to think that games were starting to cost as much as movies. But as time went on, it became more known that games had insanely high budgets, all leading us to where we are today, where your average AAA game costs more or less around 200 to 300 million just to develop. No marketing costs. A crazy high price for something that was once so small. The risk associated with AAA games these days must be unthinkable. I don't know why developers are even making them. Imagine making a AAA game for it to just fail and bankrupt your game studio. And then people ask, why don't developers take more risks? Like the consequences of a bad game isn't your entire studio going under. Obviously developers could just make smaller, more cost efficient games, but the same people begging for developers to take more risks are the same people crying when those games aren't AAA. And what even is a AAA game anyway? Because everyone's definition is varied. Mine would be a game that exudes quality and polish, but I know people who say a main factor is the IP associated with it. If we want more creative and risky games, we should be willing to face the facts that those games will not be traditional AAA games, because I have no doubt that if a studio that makes really good AAA games decided to make a game on a lesser budget, they would still make something great. One of my main concerns with $70 games is already coming to be, and that is developers charging $70 for a game that isn't worth it. Not all games should cost $70, because not all games are created equal. Some games are stacked full of microtransactions, and some are 100+ hour single player experiences. My issue lies in games like Madden or FIFA charging $70 for their games when they're full of microtransactions, and the mechanics in those games force players to spend extra cash. A $70 game should be complete, with all features included and mostly free of microtransactions. I have no problems with games selling DLC, but when that DLC is only costumes or items, it just feels like a money grab. I have an inkling that this is the reason free-to-play games are on the rise. Their gameplay loops consist of doing the same thing over and over again to progress, while giving the player the option to pay to help them with that progression, coming to an endless game loop that is an endless time sink. People spend more money on free-to-play games than regular full-priced games, and this is because they don't spend it all in one go. Normally they spend money over months and months instead of in one full-priced game. Free-to-play games trick people into thinking that they're not spending that much money, but in actual fact they are spending way more than they think they are. If you compared the amount spent on one full-price game to that of 1 month's worth of spending on a free-to-play game, the free-to-play game would have got more money out of you. Free-to-play games are perfect games for people not willing to spend the upfront price of a full-priced game, because more often than not, free-to-play games will have the same or even more content for the player to sink their teeth into day one. When developers started charging $70 for their games, the main consensus was that those games should be next-gen games with a high-quality bar, but the underlying consensus was that the developers would be getting paid more, and their working conditions would improve. And while some developers have seen this come true, most haven't. Developers in the West really haven't seen any increase in pay, unlike what's happening in Japan, where Nintendo recently raised their average salaries to keep talent from leaving. And the endless conversation around crunch is still a thing. I think crunch is an interesting topic, and if you don't know what crunch is, it's a form of strict conditions normally used when a game is behind on its internal development schedule. But sometimes people describe developers putting in extra hours of time as crunch, and I don't agree with that. If a developer is willing to put extra hours of their free time into a project, then I think that's perfectly fine. Obviously the problem lies in publishers taking advantage of these people who do this by either not paying them overtime or using them as a way to pressure other devs into doing the same. The evidence for the $70 price tag selling well is slim. I think the only game to release at $70 and be a massive seller is Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. But that is not the entire story. The $70 price tag might come with fewer sales, but the extra money gained from the price increase makes up for that loss in sales. A recent Sony investor call confirms this. Sony showed data to suggest that their sales on games with the $70 price tag were down, but the spending on those games were up. As I've said, it's not the price that stops them from selling well, well, it's the game and IP associated with it. Because look at Zelda, it's Nintendo's first $70 game, and the discourse around its price before its launch was bad at best. Now, 2 months after its release, it's on its way to outselling Breath of the Wild, the best-selling Zelda game. I feel like the reception of the price increase is a bit overdramatic. Like, why don't we just wait and see what happens before jumping to conclusions? Because for all we know, in the coming years, the price increase could lead to microtransactions being completely removed from big AAA games. Obviously, this is in an ideal world where publishers don't want to nickel and dime every consumer on the planet, but a man can dream. And I don't like the negativity around games with a $70 price tag. Like I've said, not all games should be $70, but you could make the argument that some games are worth $70. I think the problem lies in developers and publishers not speaking openly on how expensive games are to make. And if they would just come out and say, look, the game you really want is costing us a lot of money, so the price of the game is going to be $70, I feel then people would stop being so anti-$70 games. And at the end of the day, if you still think the price was too high for that game, you could always just wait for a sale or even get the game pre-owned, because people act like not playing a game day one is impossible. People definitely overblow the talking point of games used to cost $70. Like, that is true, but for the time, they were massively overpriced. Just no one knew they were, because people had nothing to gauge it against. If we look at the old video games market, there was no or very little saturation of games, giving developers the option to freely price games to whatever they wanted. And if we compare that to now, it's a very different story. Steam has given developers endless freedom to make whatever they want, and the emergence of indie games has completely changed gaming forever. Indie games are in a great position right now, not weighed down by the baggage that comes with making a AAA game, while still hitting the bar of quality that we associate with AAA games. That's not saying that all indie games are incredible. Some indie games are pretty bad, but some of the best indie games can rival some of the best the AAA gamers industry has to offer. For the next year or two, I think indie games are going to have a massive surge in popularity. A safe haven for people wanting more creativity and a smaller asking price, while AAA game developers try and find new ways to heighten the bar of quality and polish, to the point where consumers start warming up to the $70 price tag. I don't envy Sony's past or present position. I think being the first developer or publisher to establish $70 games were bound to get mass hate. But looking at what we know now about the industry as a whole, it was definitely time to start thinking about raising prices. The current industry is in a scary place, where massive publishers are 1 or 2 failed games away from filing bankruptcy. You can even see this starting to happen. Look at Square Enix. A game they released called Marvel's Avengers cost Square over $150 million to make, and guess what? It failed miserably. Such a bad failing that it resulted in all their Western developers and IP being sold to the highest bidder. I don't want to say that's the only reason why they got sold, but the timing was oddly perfect for the situation. I think my conclusion is that the games industry is in a very volatile position. There are too many situations that could lead to a crash of the market, but in reality, I don't think it'll ever get to that position. There are just too many games and developers that no matter the failings of one studio, there will always be another to hold the burden. And on the topic of $70 games, time will tell, but to be real, it's an eventuality that it will become the norm, especially if the budgets of said games stay the same or continue to rise. The games industry should try and get away from romanticizing AAA games, because with how unpredictable of a nature they have, they are too much of a risk for developers to try and bring new things to the table. At the end of the day, I think AAA games are some of the best the industry has to offer, but I think smaller games have too much of an upside that them not going down the path of making them the go-to option for developers would be a mistake. But as I've said, time will tell, and I don't expect the games industry to be the same as it is today in 5 or even 10 years' time.